What's good, folks? Got a good one for you today, because there's just so much legal news. It's a good one for you. Let's do this. So, let's get it started. Oh, let's make sure that got dinged out. Yes, it did. Okay. Jack is here. Carpe's here. The whole crew is here. Thank you, guys. Legal scope. Legal scope. It's not just one thing. Today we're going to go more Scott Adams style and just cover the entirety of the news, because there's like 5 things. I mean, they all just popped up at once for the most part. And you're right, the sound is better, because I just got a notice that Periscope finally debugged the app, so the sound finally works properly. Thank you, Periscope. Should have gotten it done a lot sooner. So we'll take this in order. Again, the order I think I'm choosing is the order of, I think, the most relevance, or at least like the biggest trending stuff. So we're going to talk about Mueller's testimony tomorrow and the news that he is going to try to bring his deputy in to also testify, what that might mean. Carpe says my shirt is being attached by leeches. Not a legal issue, oddly enough. Don't have a tort against anybody for that. Second, big tech antitrust investigation. News coming out of the Wall Street Journal first. And therefore, an antitrust investigation. This is probably like a half an hour scope, is my guess. Maybe a little longer. But it's going to be a good length, because there's just so much to talk about. So we're going to, cut it into segments at some point. Third is Michael Flynn, his business partner, Bijan Rafikian, was convicted in federal court in Alexandria, found guilty by a jury. And that's interesting news. I'll talk about whether or not that verdict will hold up, as well as what implications it might have for Michael Flynn. And there's more. Ted Cruz wants to use RICO on Antifa. And I think those are the 4 big ones. So we'll talk about those in order, see what the relevance is, and give you some legal analysis. So first, Mueller testifying tomorrow. I believe a guy named Aaron Zebney. Let's actually pull this up, because I actually have another iPad. Right, you're watching me on an iPad, but I just got another one, which is really fancy and nice and new. So I'm going to pull up the Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal said that, among other things, that Robert Mueller is going to be testifying tomorrow in front of the House committee, and I'm not forget which one, probably Judiciary, or I'm not sure exactly which one. We'll find out. And he wants to have his deputy there to testify. Now, it's not odd at all for somebody to have like somebody to go himself and testify and have advice like from a person sitting next to them. But what is strange, what is novel about this, is the idea that in the public hearing they're going to have a deputy testify. That's not DOJ policy. DOJ policy is that line attorneys don't testify. There's a variety of reasons for that. One of the primary ones is to avoid internal contradictions between line attorneys and the supervisors that are above them. But there's a variety of reasons they would want to do that. Mueller is ultimately responsible for... Wait, there's a Nazi was here. I had to block him. I apologize for that, guys, but we had to block a Nazi. So back to the discussion. So Mueller is wants his deputy to testify. That's weird. And why is it weird? What do I think is actually going on here? Well, Mueller, I think, was a little bit more of an absentee boss than people recognize. I think that's something that people fail at. If you guys remember my article that I wrote for Human Events, one of the very first ones I wrote, the first one I wrote, called Checkmate, came out on launch day. It talked about how there was this lengthy process and lengthy fight between the Trump legal team, including, at a certain point, I think, Bill Barr, rather, and Robert Mueller and Andrew Weissman over the meaning of a very particular obstruction statute, 1512 C2, and whether or not that could apply to the president's behavior. And there are real serious questions about whether or not the investigation into President Trump on obstruction was ever properly predicated. Whether or not the president's behavior could, as a matter of law, constitute obstruction of justice. If you believe Bill Barr's memorandum on the subject, which is lengthy and persuasive, you might come to the conclusion that there was never any properly predicated obstruction of justice investigation into the president. That's our issue, because it means if that was true, then the fact that Mueller knew that there was no collusion with Russia as early as November 2017 suggests that potentially Mueller and his office abused their power by continuing to investigate the president for obstruction of justice. Now, why then would Mueller be looking for deputies to help him testify? Well, that was a very complicated legal argument that was happening between Bill Barr, Trump legal team, and the Mueller special counsel's office. I did a whole explanation of how there were essentially, it was a competing legal debate, competing briefing. And at the very end of the Mueller report, most people didn't talk about this, how there was this very, lengthy attempt to justify why they were investing obstruction of justice. You think Mueller didn't really know what was going on with that? There's a good chance, that part wasn't really Mueller's bailiwick. That Mueller was sort of like a broader-based an analyst, that he never really did the full level of legal research, that he wasn't the person who did the work to justify the application of the obstruction statute. Maybe he was persuaded. What's up, Cass? Maybe he was persuaded, but he ultimately did not know the rationale. And so I have a thesis that the reason Bob Mueller is trying to bring in a deputy to help him testify is because he is worried about a line of questioning about the legal background for the obstruction investigation. Because I don't think he's really worried about questions from Democrats. I don't think he's worried. Somebody asking what law I practice, I'm not currently practicing. When I did practice, it was commercial litigation, class action law. So back to the question of what's going to happen. If Mueller is asked about the obstruction theory, I'd be really curious to see if a Republican asked him about whether or not he thought that was properly predicated. And I would be interested to see whether or not there was, whether Mueller can really answer those questions, and whether or not there is even a good answer to the question of whether or not President Trump ever was properly investigated for obstruction of justice. Because I suspect he wasn't. I suspect it was always a sham. Second, that's the first thing. I think that, and I intend tomorrow, because there's going to be a whole bunch of testimony, I intend to be watching that, and I will be putting out the content for you guys on Mueller. So I want to see, I'll be talking about questions people are asking. Hopefully it's interesting. It may be boring because, oftentimes the House of Representatives is pretty clownish, so I wouldn't be surprised, but I will be there to talk about it. Second, big tech, antitrust. News here. Again, pull out my trusty iPad, which has this. DOJ to open broad new antitrust review of big tech companies. I think this was scooped by the Wall Street Journal. There's a few novel things about this. So if you guys remember from early June, there were already noises about the FTC and DOJ and various, I think maybe one other agency, FCC, divvying up responsibility for an overall investigation into big tech illegality. And in particular, we thought that the FTC was going to look at Facebook and DOJ was going to look at Google, and they were going to divide and conquer. This news apparently suggests that there is another group of DOJ lawyers that are going to take a broader look at antitrust issues for all of these companies. So it could be in a situation where both the FTC and the DOJ are looking at, say, Google or looking at Facebook and seeing whether or not there are antitrust violations, as well as other potential legal violations. I think this is wonderful news, obviously. I think it's fantastic that we're finally taking the fight to big tech. I think, this is one of the things that the executive branch really can do. It's challenging for the executive branch with its current power to simply solve tech censorship on its own. I'm a long and firm believer that we should write new laws to protect your access to your social media accounts, that we should treat platform access as a civil right. And I don't think that President Trump can just do that by fiat. Doesn't get to make law. He's the president, he's the executive branch. But with the law on the books, with the antitrust laws, there's certainly enough to look at whether or not these are monopolies, whether or not they're abusing their competitive position. An obvious way in which they could be abusing it would be what's called tying. So the antitrust laws protect against anti-competitive behavior, even if there's not necessarily a conspiracy. If you have a monopoly and you engage in anti-competitive behavior, that can be against the law. And Ricky got there before me. And because that is against the law, things like, think about this. I mean, these companies often have terms of service that prevent their influencers from selling retweets. Like that's a thing. There's laws against that. Or not laws, rather, but there's in the terms of service. That's, in a way, forcing people to use the service's own advertising setup rather than letting anybody else using other people's platforms. It's a very interesting piece of anti-competitive behavior coming from these big tech companies. And there's other ways in which they are doing kind of interesting things that you might think are antitrust violations. Google, obviously, with email, with search, with video, with YouTube. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which they might be leveraging one monopoly service in order to force you to use their video hosting platform, right? So there's a lot of potential ways. Holy cow, 200 people just dropped off in like a second. Periscope can be weird like that. You know, I'm pretty sure 200 people, I didn't turn off that many people with one statement. Anyway, so there's a lot of potential anti-competitive behavior that DOJ can investigate. I think this is news in the sense that it really sucks to be investigated by multiple federal agencies at once. I can disclose, I once had a client, I mean, this is vague enough that I can disclose. I once had a client who was both under investigation by both the Southern District of New York and the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission sued him in Nevada, New York sued him in New York. So he's over the same basic behavior, but the SDNY was criminal, FTC was civil. He was dealing with this just massive pincer movement. It was a nightmare for him. I think he's currently in jail. Yeah. So it's not fun to be investigated by multiple federal agencies at the same time, and it's not ridiculous either. Like that happens when you have really major criminal activity. So another example of, I think, what's happening here is you can say that the big tech companies are kind of being treated like Martin Shkreli or Julian Assange, whereby federal prosecutors have decided that maybe these are bad actors, and to figure out whether or not there are criminal violations at that starting point. That might be what's going on here. I don't know, but very happy about it. There's not too much we can say at this stage because it's a really preliminary review. Reading the WSJ article just says like, no, we're expanding the review, but we really have just started. So we'll have to see whether or not there are actual antitrust violations. It can be challenging because it's not illegal to be a monopoly. You have to be, being big is not enough. You have to be both big and bad in antitrust law. So you have to engage in some sort of anti-competitive behavior or some sort of conspiracy and restraint of trade, like price fixing. But if you aren't doing those things, you aren't doing anything anti-competitive, they can't nail you just because you're big. That's a thing to understand about antitrust law. So it may not work out, but I'm glad the president is doing it. I think the big tech companies should understand that by making themselves adversarial to the conservative movement, there are financial consequences. It's not fun to be under investigation, even if you were ultimately exonerated, because you have to pay a lot of money to lawyers. So that's the problem there. Somebody asked what the deal with Mueller bringing his lawyer chief of staff tomorrow. I answered that actually in the beginning part of the scope, but just a heads up. I think Mueller, to sum up that part, I think Mueller is very worried about having to defend the legal theory underlying the obstruction investigation. Right? I suspect that he's worried that Republican congressmen will be pressing him on whether or not that the obstruction investigation was properly predicated, because it's not easy to see how any of the actions could, as a matter of law, constitute obstruction, right? Like when you're thinking about things like firing James Comey, it's a core Article 2 authority to remove subordinate executive officers. And so to suggest that that could be obstruction of justice poses separation of powers concerns, because if Congress, Article 1, is impinging on the president's core powers, Article 2, that's separation of powers, right? Congress has legislative power, president has executive power. If the Congress is saying, supposedly, if the Supreme Court reads the law to say that Congress is stealing away an Article 2 power, there's a constitutional issue. Anyway, so that's one way to think about that. Third, again, we got a lot of stuff to cover today. Today was there's like 4 news stories, all of which I want to talk about. Michael Flynn's partner in his consulting group was just convicted in federal court in Alexandria. Sidney Powell had a pretty good, Technofog had a good report on this. I recommend following Technofog. He's a good lawyer. Techno_fog on Twitter. A few more followers than me, actually. But he has basically guilty on 2 counts, guilty on both conspiracy and acting as an unregistered foreign agent of Turkey. The basic thesis behind this case is that Mr. Rafikian conspired to, one, act as an unregistered foreign agent of Turkey in the attempt to essentially change American public opinion about the question of what to do about Fethullah Gulen and whether or not to support Erdogan, And second, that he conspired to make false or misleading statements on the FARA application made by the Flynn intelligence group. Now, first, it's not clear that they actually had anything here. I mean, it's a very weird case because the conspiracy to violate FARA that they're talking about happened in 2017, and this was after Michael Flynn was already the national security advisor. Basically, what happened is that DOJ hounded Michael Flynn and tried to demand that he really quickly file FARA registration because the argument was that he hadn't filed it soon enough. And Flynn hired his good law firm, Covington and Burling, to do that. And Covington is a top world-class firm with expertise in FARA, which is a very vague, murky law that isn't prosecuted very often. So it's pretty hard to know what is necessary to include on a FARA registration statement and what you exactly have to disclose. And yet, despite the fact that Flynn outsourced it to his lawyers did their own sort of quasi-internal investigation, very highly paid, competent lawyers, and Flynn didn't have anything to do with what other people were saying to those lawyers. Somehow there was an argument that there was a conspiracy to mislead Michael Flynn's lawyers and get them to file a knowingly false registration statement. It was a bizarre thing. And I mean, there was if you remember 2 weeks ago, roughly, it seemed like they were going to try and get Flynn labeled as a co-conspirator after repeatedly representing to the court that he was not a co-conspirator in any effort to deceive federal law enforcement about FARA. So, all very strange. At the end of the day, like, this current conviction is one, it's a little bit legally infirm. The news last week was that the judge was thinking about throwing out the entire case before it even went to the jury because so much of the evidence was circumstantial. And that still might be the case. Like, the judge does not seem particularly pleased in a sense that the jury seems very impressed by this evidence against Mr. Rafikian that he was a foreign agent. But the judge was not, because the law is so very unclear and difficult to prosecute under. So there's a good chance that even in the face of this conviction, the judge will set aside the verdict in the coming days on the grounds that it is not, it's like a judge found verdict. But by the same time, that a judge overruling a jury verdict, that's the thing that can go up on appeal, and it might. But I ultimately don't think this conviction is solid enough, because I think there's fundamental problems from what I'm seeing, fundamental problems with the way that the prosecutors are trying to go about proving what this law meant, and vague criminal laws are always bad news. As for Flynn himself, I don't think that there is really any consequence of this to him. I think prosecutors might be trying to pretend that he didn't cooperate in this case in Turkey with him because he was never named as a co-conspirator. And when I went to the sentencing hearing back in December of this year, it became clear that his testimony that was not required or part of their cooperation agreement. So I don't think this should have any impact on him, especially since there was never a legal finding that he was a co-conspirator. But we'll see what happens. Okay, so that's Flynn. Finally, Ted Cruz, RICO. Ted Cruz says another legal thing just hit my breaking news feed. Facebook settlement requires Mark Zuckerberg to certify compliance. Ooh, very scary for Mark. You generally don't want to be signing a attestation under oath that says you certify that something is happening complying with the law. It's not fun when you're a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, because there's a lot you don't know, and you just kind of have to certify anyway. That's some big news. Ted Cruz called for RICO laws to be used against Antifa. This is something I floated about a month ago that Jack also picked up on. RICO laws are tricky. I'm not sure they're going to work against Antifa, but it's worth looking into. The basic RICO is racketeering. Racketeering usually deals with some sort of criminal enterprise, and an enterprise, from my reading, looks like it has something to do with trying to sell something. So organized crime is often trying to sell something like sex workers or gambling or gambling, prostitution, numbers games, like any number of protection. Like, all of these are enterprises that are sort of targeted by RICO, and the structure of RICO is so that you can get at the higher level people rather than have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they personally engaged in it when you just don't have evidence because they ordered underlings to do it. Trump just complained about a never-Trump lawyer being allowed to prep Mueller. Let me see. Well, it seems my scope is very timely. So we'll get back to Ted Cruz. I'm going to read this tweet. This is what happens, You do something live, and suddenly Trump makes news, and all of a sudden we can just talk about it live. Be the first ones to respond. Yep, Trump tweet, literally 3 minutes ago. Quote, just got back only to hear of a last-minute change allowing a never-Trumper attorney to help Robert Mueller with his testimony before Congress tomorrow. What a disgrace to our system. Never heard of this before. Very unfair, should not be allowed. A rigged witch hunt. Yeah, sounds like, to me, again, I just think Robert Mueller is going to have trouble answering a few questions about why he investigated on obstruction. I don't, because here's the thing, the older lawyers don't do the legal research, man. That's something I'll give you a hint from big law practice. I'll give you a hint. Older lawyers don't do legal research. They don't. Why do they not do legal research? Well, because legal researches can be done by younger attorneys, and clients generally don't like it when expensive partners who are billing at $1,000 an hour do legal research when they have associates that could do it for $300 an hour, right? So that they don't usually do the legal research. What that means is often the people with the best understanding of the law on a particularly complicated question are not the people at the top, are not the partners who end up arguing the case, oddly enough. It's often the underlings who actually have a better handle on the law in particular circumstances. So I have a suspicion, again, that Robert Mueller doesn't have a full handle on the law justifying the obstruction investigation. I think that was mostly his deputies who came up with that one, and that he just signed off on it, which means I don't think he really wants to answer questions about that at all. It's my suspicion. That's what I think is going on. As Bo says, Weissman. Indeed. So he says, does that potentially change the outcome of tomorrow's testimony? It means, if he's allowed to do so, that Robert Mueller is a lot less likely to perjure himself, or a lot less likely to make a fool of himself. Because if he has a deputy who is one of the people responsible for developing the obstruction theory, who's prepared to answer questions on it, it's a lot more likely that that person will make less of a fool of himself on it than Mueller if Mueller himself is not deep in the literature. Especially if there are a few Republican congressmen who are lawyers who are well prepared. I'm not certain that's going to be the case. I don't know if Matt Gaetz is on this committee, and of course, since it's a House committee, House committees don't have as much time to ask questions. They only get 5 minutes. They can't go into detail, and many House members are simply not at the level of, say, the Senate Judiciary Committee, right? Like if you think about who the Republicans currently have on Senate Judiciary, it's actually a really nasty lineup of pretty good lawyers, right? Like you got Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley. Those are Supreme Court clerks, right? Those are in Supreme Court. I don't know if Hawley did Supreme Court litigation, but I think he probably did some. I know Ted Cruz is arguing for the Supreme Court. Those are very, very good lawyers. You don't want to be. Mueller does not want to be defending himself against being examined by lawyers at that level. I don't think there's a single Democrat with legal credentials of either Cruz or Hawley. So, Supreme Court clerks are a real deal, which is why Cruz and Hawley are so sharp. But that's what I suspect is going on here. And I don't know. Trump is making fun of him for it. I think it's a bad look for Mueller to try and do this, and it makes me think he's worried. Like last minute trying to get this to happen, I think they're worried. I think part of the issue, maybe a moot went badly, maybe Mueller's off his game, he's feeling slow and a little old. Like, remember, the only public statement we've heard from Robert Mueller is when he did that press conference and didn't take any questions. Like, nobody's asked, he's not answered a question from the media or anybody, right? He has not answered a question. Robert Mueller has not answered a question. I think it's a bad look. I think there's plenty of, he's just not effectively, handling the brief. And I think that this is a last minute desperation move. Like, do you think this would be necessary if things were going wrong in preparing Mueller for his testimony? I don't think Mueller is particularly happy about being asked to testify. I don't think he's at the top of his game anymore. And I think he's just out of his depth here. So that's what I see as a potential pitfall for Robert Mueller. Again, as I said, tomorrow I'll be watching and looking. So I think we're going to talk briefly about Ted Cruz and Antifa. RICO is a problem because it's hard to find an enterprise. It's not clear whether or not Antifa is engaged in any sort of business. If they're trying to sell drugs or something, maybe you could get them on RICO. I'm not sure it'll work, but let the lawyers do the research and figure it out, right? I'm always for opening up some creative lawyering into our adversaries. Marky asks, is Weissman going to be there tomorrow? I don't know the answer. Which actually gives me the fact that I'm done talking, so I'm here to take questions. If you guys have questions for me about any of these legal matters, then do this. Am I going to live tweet the Mueller hearing? Yes. Will there be a scope after the testimony? Yes. Wanda I agree, Wanda. Seems adamant about not talking. Antifa sells merchandise? Yes, but is it doing through criminal activity? Is the criminal activity facilitating the merchandise sales? Arguably. I don't know. Am I a lawyer? Yes, I am a lawyer. I don't practice, but I am licensed in California and the District of Columbia. Thank you, Paul. If you guys like the idea of fire content, hit the ... in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen and the follow button, and follow me on Periscope as well. The compliance thing with Zuckerberg, who issues something like that? Stupid question, I know. So the compliance thing is part of the FTC settlement. The FTC can engage in any number of settlements, and when the FTC has a settlement, they can demand behavior from the defendant company. So basically what will happen is, as part of the settlement, Zuckerberg agrees to do the certification, so every year he writes a letter with his lawyer's help certifying what he must certify to the FTC. Why not use terrorism laws to go after Antifa? Good question. I'm not sure there's like a distinct, I think you could try it. At the end of the day, I'm not sure like the terrorism laws are really there to deal with domestic terrorism as distinct from any other crime, right? It's, they're like, it's hard to say. I need to look into them. I'm not really an expert. To be frank, I'm not really an expert on the nation's terrorism laws. It's not something I've looked into. What about Ray today? Ray saying that Antifa isn't an organization seems a little bit like the line Antifa wants to take. There are clearly cells of Antifa, even if Antifa is not like a nationwide organization with any centralized command and control structure. So, McVeigh laws, that's right. Oh yeah, I saw that. The MAGA coalition is suing Q. That's funny enough. I mean, that's sort of the catchphrase. The MAGA coalition is suing whoever is posting and pretending to be Q. Apparently, in some Q posts on 8chan, there was defamation of this nonprofit that I think Adam Gingrich and Ginger McQueen are involved with, and so they're suing and trying to figure out who those people are. It'd be challenging. I don't know what the data is, so getting the IP address and figuring out who the defendant actually is in those cases, probably not easy. But if they can do it, maybe they got a case. I don't know. I'd have to read, like, defamation is a very difficult case to win from plaintiff side, one, and I have no idea what was actually said and whether or not it's true, and whether or not MAGA coalition has suffered damages in any meaningful way, so, or whether it's defamation per se. Like, I can't really give you a decent legal analysis because I know, like, barely any facts. Like, the only thing I really know about that is that the MAGA coalition is suing Q. Ragu asked a good question. What questions would I ask Mueller? Well, I would ask Mueller about the legal theory underlying the obstruction investigation. Like, did you read Bill Barr's memo? Why did you disagree with it? Like, I would have a legal debate with Mueller about the meaning of 1512c2 and how far it would go. That's what I would focus on, because from my perspective, like, that's the weakest part of all this. This investigation should have been over in November 17, but because Mueller, and probably with Weissman's help, stretched the meaning of this one particular criminal statute, they were able to extend the investigation for over a year and keep the country in chaos and sort of on pins and needles, wondering what the result of the Mueller investigation would be. Seb Gorka named Human Events the third best conservative publication. Well, that's good. I'll take it. That's not bad. Given that we've been around for like 3 months, to be third best in the country, that's from Seb Gorka's perspective. It's not bad at all. I'll take it. I'll take it. It's not bad at all. Will Hawley and Cruz ask that question? No, they will not ask the question tomorrow because it's in front of the House and it's not Senate Judiciary Committee. Somebody says, I need to be Trump's lawyer. Well, if there are any people in the White House watching this, the ... in the bottom right corner screen, the follow button will give you access to my fire legal hot takes whenever they come out. So there you go. Who needs to hire me when you can get my fire legal hot takes on Twitter? Did he actually Gorka did a write-up of Human Events? I'm really excited. I need to thank him if he's done that. I didn't see it. So I will check it out. Will occasional Cortex ask questions? I don't know. Who's the best lawyer in the House GOP? I actually don't know. I mean, the House GOP caucus is like 200 strong, so I really don't know who the good lawyers are. Gates is not bad, but he doesn't have like he doesn't have the pedigree. I'm sure there are like some actual like Harvard lawyers in there who've got experience. Yeah, I'll do it on WenHub. Yeah, I'll give advice to the White House on WenHub. All right, hi Fox News producers, how's it going? Problematic consequences of banning covering faces of Antifa with people with future facial recognition. I mean, that's a whole scope talk. We can talk about that later. Jordan's pretty smart. I don't know if he's a lawyer though. Yeah, $200 an hour for lawyers is cheap. That's not what I was billing out at. I was billing out at like $550. I wasn't making $550 an hour, but I was billing out at $550 an hour as a first year. My first year at the firm. Firm was very pricey. We had some good partners. They could demand pretty high rates. And when am I coming to Texas? I do not know. All right, I think that's good. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. I'll be around tomorrow to talk about the Mueller investigation, and I will see you all later. Thank you so much. Thank you, and honestly, thank you guys. I know it's been a while, but I'll see you all soon. Peace.